Hey everyone, ahlan wa sahlan fikum. I'm really excited for today's episode because it's very long overdue, yet it's about a really essential topic. Many months ago, I posted a video about auxiliary verbs to express desire in the future, where we talked about how you can use certain words to modify the meaning of a verb. For example, badros can become bhab adros, biddi adros, or rah adros. Today's episode finally is part 2 on auxiliary verbs, where we're going to talk about expressing ability and by extension, possibility, permission, and request. Let's get started. Okay, so remember that we're discussing auxiliary terms today. What this means is that every single word I'm going to introduce today is used in exactly the same way. You put it before the verb to change its meaning, and the verb itself goes in the subjunctive. Anyway, let's start with a very basic but important verb, edir, meaning to be able to. It's a basic form 1 verb with kasra vowels in the past tense. So edir means he was able, and bidar, of course, means he is able. Of course, another way we can translate this is can, as in I can speak Arabic. And in order to make that sentence, again, all we do is attach edir before the action that I'm able to do and put the action in the subjunctive. So bihki Arabi is he speaks Arabic, and bidar yahki Arabi is he is able to speak Arabic. A more interesting example is hal fatra ma bnqdar nitla min al-bayt. These days, we're not able to leave the house. It's also common to use the active participle qadir, basically meaning able. Mish qadir afham kalamu, I'm not able to understand what he's saying. Although by itself, ana mish qadir can also mean I'm not feeling well or I'm feeling sick. Anyway, I personally prefer to translate edir as to be able to rather than simply can do something, because first of all, edir is actually a verb. Plus, it's very much related to ability, whereas in many ways can also conveys something you have permission to do or even something that is possible. So the next word I want to discuss today is probably the most important one because it really translates as can insofar as it has a wide scope of meaning. That word is mumkin. As you can see, mumkin is not a verb. In fact, it's technically the active participle of yumkin, but I'll come back to that. So first of all, what does it mean by itself? The most literal translation of mumkin would probably be possible, which combines the notion of ability, something you're able to do, and also probability, something that may happen. In most cases though, a more fitting translation would be can or even could, since these words can convey both of these meanings too. But although in English you can't just say can out of nowhere, saying mumkin by itself is very common. It's similar to saying it could be or it's possible. For example, hey, we should meet up tomorrow. Mumkin, we could, maybe. And in fact, you can take these even further and say is a mumkin, if possible, and so on. But now let's take an example situation and actually use mumkin as an auxiliary. Even though mumkin is not a verb, as an auxiliary, it's used the same way as edir. So let's say I tell you, Wallah sirt mish qadir adrus bil bayt. I really can't study at home anymore. So you say, طب ممكن تروح على المكتبة. Okay, you can go to the library. So I reply, صح ممكن بكرة أجرب أروح عليها. True, I could try to go there tomorrow. As you can see, we've used edir once and mumkin twice, and each time the idea was slightly different. First I was saying I'm not able to do something. Second time was offering a suggestion. You could try this. It's possible for you to do this. And the third was more about expressing probability. I'm able to do it, but there's some uncertainty. I might do it. It's possible that I will do it. Now this is where it's worth mentioning yimkin. In standard Arabic, yumkin is the main way of saying maybe, and you can even add suffixes to it and everything. So it's very versatile. In spoken Arabic though, yimkin, as it's pronounced, is not as commonly used because it's mostly a standalone word meaning maybe, and although you can use it as an auxiliary, it has the specific meaning of may, so it only expresses probability rather than ability, whereas mumkin can express either. Of course, that means there's definitely some overlap. For example, you can say either mumkin ajarrib aruh or yumkin ajarrib aruh. As you can see, the meaning is essentially the same. Anyway, we've spoken about ability and possibility. But what about ability in the sense of asking for permission or making requests? Can I or may I do this or that? Could you do this or that for me? First of all, it's possible to use mumkin for this as well. Mumkin أرنك بعدين? Can I call you later? Mumkin تحكي لي ليش? Can you tell me why? That's why I've said mumkin is probably the most useful of all the words today, since it's very versatile and covers a lot of different meanings. It's mostly a matter of changing the conjugation of the subjunctive to indicate whether I'm asking about something I can do or something I'm asking you to do. Now, I've been asked about politeness registers in spoken Arabic, whether certain expressions seem rude or how to sound more polite and respectful. To be honest, compared to other languages, this is not something to worry about in Arabic. Many languages have distinct polite and casual forms in speech, as in Spanish and Farsi, where you have a formal and informal you with their own separate conjugations. In Arabic though, there's no such thing. So the default way of speaking is basically suitable across the board. While there are certain ways of addressing someone to sound extra respectful, like referring to someone as ustaz, obviously it's not required, and it's not rude to just speak normally. With regards to mumkin specifically, it's definitely perfectly fine to use it to ask for permission and to make requests, because even though it's really common, it's already relatively polite. The reason is because in many languages, polite speech is marked by being more indirect. And even though mumkin تحكي لي ليش could translate as can you tell me why, which is pretty direct, a more exact translation is actually is it possible for you to tell me why, which is actually pretty indirect. So even the default word mumkin is already polite and safe to use. Still, I'm going to teach you two other words that are even more indirect ways of making requests. Let's start with the verb zabat, which in the present is bozbot. Now what does it mean? I think a useful translation would be to work, but not as in working a job. Rather, it means that something is suitable or fitting. So bozbot lak means does it work for you, or is that suitable for you? That's why saying bozbot may be slightly more polite, because bozbot ta'mil li qahwa, would it work for you to make me some coffee, is maybe just a little more indirect than mumkin ta'mil li qahwa. But honestly, it's not a huge difference. It's similar to the way could you make me some coffee is slightly more polite in English than can you make me some coffee, because could introduces a slight connotation of uncertainty, so it feels a little bit less commanding. But again, this is a really subtle thing, and as I said, mumkin is already polite and safe to use. Anyway, bozbot is also used more generally to ask whether something is suitable or works for someone else. So for example, bozbot nilta'i bukra, would it work for us to meet tomorrow? It's definitely related to the idea of ability, since you're asking whether someone is able to do something under a particular circumstances, for example, meeting at a certain time. But notice that bozbot is always in the huwa conjugation, precisely because you're not actually asking if you are able. You're asking if the conditions are suitable for you to do it. So bozbot refers to those conditions rather than to the other person's ability per se. Lastly, there's another word that works pretty much exactly like zabat, which is nafa or binfa in the present. Technically it means to be useful, suitable, or valid, but the idea is exactly the same as with bozbot. Binfa nilta'i bukra? I would just say that bozbot is more versatile and is often used to make requests, as in bozbot ta'mil li qahwa. Whereas binfa is more associated with asking whether certain conditions are suitable. Either way, binfa can be used in other ways too, as in the expression ma binfa, meaning it's no good or it's no use. The last word for today is a fun one that I haven't mentioned before. Let's go back to asking for permission. We know we can use mumkin to ask, can I do such and such? But we can also use the word ma'alesh. Ma'alesh just means it's okay, especially in response to an apology, for example. But I can also say, ma'alesh as'alek shi? Is it okay for me to ask you something? I like this expression because it's not really formal, but it's still politely indirect. Is it okay to do this? Rather than simply, can I do this? But again, all these different expressions are equally valid, and it's ultimately up to you to decide what feels most natural and what's most fitting for the situation. I use all of these expressions at different times, and being able to add just that little bit of extra variety to your expressiveness is a really neat touch that gets you lots of brownie points. Anyway, that's all I had for today. There's going to be at least one more video about these really crucial auxiliary verbs, so get excited for that. Either way, I'll see you next time.
اهلا حبايبي وشكرا للجماعه اللي بيحضروا القناه. اذا بدكم تكملوا تشوفوا هالفيديوز اعملوا سبسكرايب، واذا شفتوني مؤخرا تفضلوا روحوا شوفوا الفيديوز الماضيه بالبلاي ليست، وتذكروا اني عملت مصادر لتعلم اللهجه الفلسطينيه تقدروا تلاقوها بالموقع تبعي اللي مكتوب تحت بالديسكربشن، وبشوفكم المره الجايه.